Has Lewis Hamilton just shown that Ferrari already has a car capable of fighting for victories? Or are we simply seeing the first warning that the 7-time world champion still has much more to offer in Formula One? Subscribe to continue uploading more of this type of content now, if we continue. Because what happened in the sprint race of the 2026 Chinese Grand Prix was a true declaration of intentions. Ferrari placed Charles Leclerc second with the new SF26, while Lewis Hamilton finished third, putting in a performance full of aggressiveness, intelligence, and pace that was reminiscent of his best days in the category. And although the final result says third place, the feeling that Hamilton left on the track was completely different. It was that of a driver who pressed again from the beginning, who attacked when he saw the opportunity, and who forced everyone in front to make mistakes or defend themselves to the limit. But here comes a really interesting thing. Because while Hamilton pushed to the limit during the early stages of the sprint, Leclerc took advantage of the pace of the SF26 to consolidate a huge result for Ferrari, finishing second and putting the Italian team in a perfect strategic position for the rest of the weekend. So what we are going to analyze today is not just another sprint race. We are going to understand why Hamilton was one of the most aggressive and decisive drivers of the entire race, how Leclerc managed to convert the potential of the SF26 into a key second place, and above all what this result means for Ferrari in a season where the balance between teams seems tighter than ever. The sprint race of the 2026 Chinese Grand Prix began with enormous tension on the grid because everyone knew that the Shanghai circuit does not forgive mistakes. It is a route that mixes extremely long straights with technical areas that force drivers to find a perfect balance between top speed, braking stability, and tire wear management. In a short race like the sprint, where each lap has an enormous weight in the final result, any detail can completely change the development of the test. In that context, Ferrari arrived with many eyes on it. The new SF26 had shown promising signs over the weekend, and there was growing expectation as to whether the Italian team had really made that competitive leap it had been seeking for some time. The focus was on how its two drivers would respond against direct rivals who also arrived with very competitive cars. From the moment the lights went out, it was clear that Lewis Hamilton was not going to run the sprint simply to score some points. His start was aggressive, determined, typical of a driver who perfectly understands that in this format there is no time to wait. Every position gained in the first meters can make the difference between fighting for the podium or getting stuck in traffic in the middle group. Hamilton began to attack from the start, looking for gaps, applying pressure on the brakes, and placing the Ferrari in positions where other drivers would have hesitated. That offensive attitude allowed him to quickly get into the direct fight for the first positions, generating one of the most intense moments of the sprint when he began his direct duel with George Russell. In one of the most delicate braking events on the circuit, Hamilton launched a determined attack on the inside to try to take the lead, once again showing that competitive instinct that has characterized him throughout his career. For a few moments, he managed to get ahead, but the Mercedes responded immediately, taking advantage of its speed on the straight to regain position in the next braking zone. That exchange made something very important clear. Hamilton was willing to fight every meter of the circuit, but while that duel was taking place in the lead, another protagonist began to appear strongly in the race. Charles Leclerc, who started from further back, was executing a silent but very effective comeback with the SF26. Lap after lap, he reduced the distance with the front group, taking advantage of the competitive pace of the Ferrari and the fights that occurred in front of him. When the first drivers began to stabilize their positions after the initial battles, Leclerc was already close enough to enter the DRS zone and begin to seriously push for podium positions. This is where the sprint race began to show one of its most interesting characteristics. Unlike a traditional race, where drivers can take more time to manage pace or wait for strategic opportunities, in sprint each lap is an opportunity that cannot be wasted. The margins are minimal, and the constant pressure forces the pilots to maintain an extreme level of concentration. Hamilton knew it perfectly. During the first laps of the race, the Briton was squeezing the Ferrari to the maximum, trying to stay in the direct fight for victory while controlling the pressure that was beginning to come from behind. And that pressure had a first and last name: Charles Leclerc. The Monegasque had managed to get rid of several rivals and was beginning to quickly approach the front group. The SF26 seemed to perform very well in more technical areas of the circuit, allowing him to close the gap lap after lap until he was directly behind Hamilton. At that time, Ferrari was in an extremely interesting situation in the race. Its two drivers were fighting in the front positions against direct rivals and demonstrating that the car had enough pace to stay in that battle. But the sprint also began to reveal another important factor that would influence the final result: tire management. As the laps progressed, some cars began to show signs of wear on their tires, something especially delicate in Shanghai due to the long, variable radius corners that put a lot of demands on the front tires. The drivers had to find a balance between maintaining the competitive pace and preventing wear and tear from compromising their performance in the final laps. It was precisely in this phase where Russell's Mercedes began to show a slight advantage in stability and sustained pace, which allowed it to consolidate first position while the Ferraris maintained the pressure from behind. Leclerc finally managed to overtake Hamilton and move into second position, while the Briton continued to defend third place in a race that was beginning to be defined as the final laps approached. But far from seeming like a loss of pace, Hamilton's performance throughout this phase of the race demonstrated something very clear. He was pushing the Ferrari to the limit of its possibilities. He had attacked when he had to attack, he had defended when necessary, and he had maintained enough competitive pace to secure a podium position in an extremely contested sprint. And at the same time, Ferrari had managed to place its two cars in the first positions of the short race, with Leclerc second and Hamilton third, a result that clearly reflected the potential of the SF26 at the start of the season. However, the most interesting of all was not only the final result of the sprint. What was truly important was the feeling that Ferrari left on the track, because for the first time in a long time, it seemed that the Italian team not only had speed in qualifying or specific moments of performance, but could also maintain a competitive pace against some of the strongest rivals on the grid. The most interesting part of the China 2026 sprint began when the race entered its decisive phase. After the first explosive turns and initial battles for position, the front group began to stabilize. But that apparent calm hid a much deeper strategic struggle: who would be able to maintain the pace without destroying their tires, and who would still have something in store for the final laps. At that point, the race had already revealed three clear protagonists. On the one hand, there was George Russell's Mercedes consolidating the lead. On the other hand, Charles Leclerc appeared with the Ferrari SF26 firmly in second position. And just behind was Lewis Hamilton, maintaining third place, but never losing the reference of the two cars in front of him. This is where Hamilton's true expertise began to show. Because while many drivers in a sprint tend to push the limit from start to finish, Hamilton started doing something much smarter. He adjusted his pace. He began to manage tire wear and maintain a distance that would allow him to remain within the front group without compromising the performance of the Ferrari in the final laps. This is no coincidence. It is one of the skills that have defined his career. Hamilton perfectly understands how races evolve even when they are short. He knows when to attack and when to simply stay within the competitive range and wait for the race to develop in his favor. That reading of the moment is something that only drivers with many years of experience in Formula One can execute with such precision. Meanwhile, Charles Leclerc was putting in an equally impressive performance with the SF26. After having reached second position, the Monegasque began to put pressure on the leader, trying to reduce the distance. The Ferrari seemed to behave very solidly in the long corners of the Shanghai circuit, allowing Leclerc to stay within a competitive window against the Mercedes that was leading the race. That constant pace was one of the keys to the sprint for Ferrari. For many years, the Italian team had suffered precisely at this point, maintaining a competitive pace for several consecutive laps without the car beginning to degrade the tires too much or lose aerodynamic balance. But in this sprint, the SF26 seemed much more stable, allowing its two drivers to stay in the fight without suffering sudden drops in performance. And that had a very important consequence. Ferrari wasn't just defending positions, it was competing directly against the strongest teams on the grid. As the race progressed, the gaps between the top three began to stabilize. Russell had managed to create a small advantage thanks to the performance of his car in certain areas of the circuit, while Leclerc held firm in second position, trying to maintain contact with the leader. Hamilton, for his part, remained third, but always within a relatively close distance that allowed him to react if any opportunity arose. And in sprint race, any detail can become that opportunity. A small error in braking, a tire that begins to lose grip, or simply poor traffic management can completely change the outcome of the race. That's why Hamilton never stopped pushing. Although he did not make desperate attacks, his constant presence behind Leclerc's Ferrari and the leading Mercedes kept the tension alive in the final laps. The situation also reflected something very interesting within the Ferrari team itself. The two drivers were in extremely competitive positions, but each was playing a different role within the race. Leclerc was focused on maximizing the chance of finishing second and even trying to get closer to the leader, while Hamilton was tasked with ensuring the team kept 2 cars on the sprint podium. That combination ended up giving a very important result. When the race came to an end, Ferrari had managed to place its 2 cars in the top 3. Charles Leclerc crossed the finish line in second position with the SF26, while Lewis Hamilton secured third place after an intense and very well-managed race from a strategic point of view. It may seem like just a solid result in a sprint race, but the real meaning goes much deeper. Because what this short race made clear is that Ferrari seems to have finally found a car capable of consistently fighting at the front. The SF26 not only showed speed, it also demonstrated balance, stability, and a race management ability that for years had been one of the Italian team's weak points. And at the same time, he left something even more interesting on the table. Lewis Hamilton remains one of the most complete drivers on the entire grid. Even in a format as demanding as the sprint, where every second counts and where drivers often run at the absolute limit, Hamilton once again demonstrated that his ability to read the race, manage resources, and stay competitive remains intact. That is why the third place it achieved in China has a special value. It was not simply another position in the classification. It was a demonstration that when the car responds, Hamilton still has the ability to immediately place himself among the protagonists of Formula One. Because beyond the final third place, what Hamilton left on the track was the feeling that he still has a lot to say within Formula One. His aggressiveness in the first turns, his ability to attack when the opportunity arose, and above all, his way of managing the pace of the race showed that the 7-time world champion still has that competitive instinct that made him a sporting legend. Subscribe to continue uploading more of that content. Now you really think about all this.